This is Impolite Conversation. Joining Willis this week are Keisha Capri and Dr. Shelley Blundell.
Welcome to Impolite Conversation. I'm Willis Gordon. This week we're talking about women's role in the 21st century. Is feminism still necessary? We'll talk about women's roles in business, education, healthcare, and the world over. Now I've got two very educated, very smart women to talk to you all about this. I learned a lot. Let's see what you can see. Sit back, relax, grab a drink, and enjoy this episode. Hey everybody, welcome to Impolite Conversation. I'm here today with Keisha Capri, who is an Amazon best-selling author, and Dr. Shelley Blundell, who is an information doctor and a latter-day feminist. Now, we're here today, we're talking about the importance of women in our culture globally. We're talking about the effects of media, both positive and negative, and we're also going to talk a little bit about education and mental health. All right. Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about was Justice Scalia just died. Some people are happy, some people are sad, but either way, there's going to be a huge change in the country with a new Supreme Court justice. What do you guys think the country needs to look like in, say, the next 30 years in order to make it more conducive for women to be successful?
Well, I obviously think it needs to be diverse, obviously, and I think that women need to take more of a leadership role in all areas. And I think that women get scared a lot because they're not, I don't know, they're seen as bitches if they get into a leadership position. But I do think that the diversity needs to spread, definitely. I'm ready for a woman president anyway. So, but that's just my personal opinion.
Now, you talk about that. You talk about women being perceived as bitches if they're. Now, do you think there is a male leadership style as opposed to a female leadership style? And if so, if you guys have had bosses or anything like that, or if you guys have looked at that, what do you think the difference is?
Well, I can speak to this a little bit because I've had both male and female bosses. I think Keisha's perception is correct that sometimes women who are in positions of leadership are seen as being aggressive or arrogant, whereas males who are in the same position are seen as leaders or authoritative. Right. Even the language used around women in leadership positions tends to be negative as opposed to positive. And one thing that I've noticed is, especially with some women I've spoken to who are both in leadership roles or in subservient roles to women, is that they feel like there's this innate sense of female competition. Whereas I don't necessarily feel like that's the case for already pre-established male dominant leadership positions.
So basically, if there's no need for male competition because everybody was guys in the first place, there's no need to break any ceiling, there's no need to break in anywhere. So if women are trying maybe for a single spot at the top, because that might only be the only thing available, you think there's just more competition there because of that simple fact that there's not a lot of women in there in the first place?
Well, I think that's part of the reason. I think the other part about it is, and Sheryl Sandberg, the illustrious Facebook WYSIWYG person, when she came out with a lot of her strong opinions based on the premise that women can have it all within reason, and there was a lot of backlash from second wave feminists, the Gloria Steinem generation people. And then there were other women coming forward and saying, yeah, well, technically that's possible, but the sacrifices that she's talking about are monumental. And Sandberg even goes into it in her book where she talks about, the sacrifices she had to make with her family and the sacrifices she had to make on the social end and how it actually made her ill. Wow. So I don't necessarily think that same patina is applied to men in positions of power. I don't think I've ever heard a male in an authoritative role asked, well, don't you have children at home?
Now, I've just got a couple statistics that I had just read, that as of 2008, 57.1% of PhDs are being earned by women in this country, and it's a majority for the first time in American history. And I just think, what are your guys' thoughts on that? I know you've been through the PhD program. You can tell me a little bit about that. I know you're getting your master's. And so just to illustrate here, if people think that the statistics aren't true, you've got two very highly educated women here, and this smoke who doesn't even have a college degree. So I'm just letting you guys know it's for real. It's the real deal. So. I mean, what do you guys think about the education system? What do you think? Are there still hurdles, even though you guys are getting more PhDs, even though you guys are enrolling in college more than ever? Do you think there are still hurdles, even within that structure, that are still hurting women? And what do you think they are?
I mean, I would have to say, now this is just personally speaking, that even as getting my master's, I still feel like it's a hurdle. And this could be just all in my head as far as just what the stereotypes are. So people wouldn't assume I would have my master's.
Right.
They wouldn't assume I attend one of the top schools in the nation. They don't know that. And, I would assume that people would not expect for me to have that high of education, but I do.
Right.
And I think that's part of the hurdle, too, is just the diversity aspect of it. They assume that men, especially white men, would have a more of a higher education, will be taken more seriously.
Right.
On top of that, I read a statistic about how women do not negotiate their pay.
Right.
How men do.
Right.
And that is, I would have to say that's something that I struggle with. Like, I'm like, how am I supposed to go into an interview and ask for...
Is that an innate confidence thing, you think, that is sort of cultural?
I think so. And I think it just goes back to that whole arrogance, women are seen in a different light. And, even people ask me, well, when are you going to have kids? Or you'll get married one day. I'm just like, wait, what?
I saw a great thing. And talking about this confidence and going in and doing things, I saw something great online the other day. I think it was Facebook or Twitter or something. But it was a banner that this girl had put up that it said, "Lord, please grant me the confidence of a mediocre white man." And I just thought it was the funniest thing I had seen because it's there's enough truth in that to make it sting, but it's still really funny because of the fact that there are some people who are just and I have, being a performer and doing these other things, I've had confidence since I was a kid, just being able to go out and do that. And I think, one, that's part of nurture, but that's also, it's also naturally, some people are just naturally outgoing, gregarious, confident people. But other times you have to be nurtured into saying, no, you can ask for these things. It's all right, you deserve this. Or if you've worked this hard, go get it. And that if that's not being given to people, do you think that that's a reason why that's happening, or do you think there's still something holding you back? What do you think? You said you disagree.
It's just so hard. Like, probably every day on social media, I look at some guy saying, "Oh, well, you women need to stop being so independent, acting like you don't need us." Like, what?
Boy.
Like, I see that all the time, and it makes me feel bad for wanting to do something with my life. And it just
really,
yeah, like I get that sense of, well, should I not have gotten a master's degree because you feel in a certain type of way? And it's crazy how it will play the whole, oh, well, y'all need to stop acting so independent.
Okay. Now, one thing I do have to bring up, you talked about the stereotypes and people not thinking you would be where you are.
Right.
And Black women are actually enrolling in college more at a higher rate than any other demographic as of like, I think 2011. I think they just released this. It was a census, and I think it was like 9.7%. And it was something that these people were coming in, and just no matter what, white men, Asian men, white females, anybody else, but Black women, and I say Black because Black is encompassing of a lot of things, because if we said African American, both of you guys would qualify. Because, I mean, technically it's true, Shelley's from South Africa.
Yeah.
So I wonder why a lot of times facts will be on people's side in saying something is correct, or this is the way that the world is moving, but the narrative is staying 10, 5, 15 years behind, where you guys shouldn't be independent acting like you don't need us. It's like, well, if you look at where, just looking at the three of us, if you would think, which one of these people has a college degree, and it's like, oh, well, I know he probably does. He's got a suit on, and blah, blah, blah. And in all actuality, this person's got a PhD, this person's on the way to the master's, and I have a high school education. I did 4 years in the Navy. So there's
still something to be proud about.
Well, absolutely, but I just think if we're talking about higher education, if we're talking about in the professional realm, and another reason why I try and encourage, all my, younger relatives and our two boys at home, get good grades. Get into college, do the stuff you need to do that now, because the world is getting so competitive that a college degree, just a basic 4-year degree, is the equivalent of a high school degree 50 years ago. It's getting to that situation, and not everybody is going to be in the line of work that I'm in. where you can make things, you can make your own way. So I want to get kind of your insights, because I don't know what the PhD program is like firsthand. I've just had friends who've been through it. I want to know what that's like as a woman, and I also want to know, obviously we know it's very stressful, all these things, but there's something underneath that. There's something
absolutely.
sort of seeding underneath that. What is that?
Well, and initially, to circle back to what we started talking about, very much the narrative that accompanies women in power, and especially women in power in a first world country.
Right.
I think it's largely to do with the legislature.
Okay.
And, the power base. What we're seeing right now, that Hillary Clinton has recruited Madeleine Albright to say, if you're a woman and you don't vote for us, then you don't like women, which is the most anti-feminist thing I've ever heard in my life.
Okay.
And, you have this huge debate now coming after Scalia's death about, oh, well, is Obama allowed to elect somebody? I think of how revolutionary it was when Sonia Sotomayor was appointed a few years back, and she brought an incredible diversity to the justices. And then I read an article talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg considering Scalia one of her best friends, and I thought, what? And then you see it's because she said, he made me be a better Supreme Court justice.
I believe that.
He made me argue my opinions more in depth and more passionately, just like his, even though some of them were completely bananas.
Right.
He did it with power, and that's what matters.
And I think that's true. And I think the whole basis for this show is kind of in that vein of, you may not agree, you may not like it, you may have completely, how would I say this? It's, if you just have dissenting opinions or completely diametrically opposed, really. I think that's the phrase I want to use. Diametrically opposed, just completely on the other side of things. If you have that, but you can still get along. And I think part of the Supreme Court's magic in that way is the fact that not a lot of things are leaked in the process. Their process is pretty secretive. And the fact that they don't have to worry about running for election. They don't have to worry about getting reelected. So they can be completely themselves and then kind of come to terms with that. And I think if more people were able to say, I disagree with you, however, I can still respect you as a person, I still like you, but we can still get together and wrestle out a policy. I do think, though, a lot of people were saying, and I will say this right now, I know it's not the most diplomatic thing to say, but this is impolite conversation. I was not sad. I was not sad to hear it. I just wasn't. It's there are certain times, I was just reading over some of the decisions that he's made. And there are certain cases where, affirmative action, just recently, where he was talking about, maybe black students should be on slower tracks in education because they shouldn't get into, University of Texas because of, and it wasn't like certain black students. It was just black students, blanketed statement. And kicking the bucket does not make you a better person. I just think that when someone dies, even if you disagree with them, and you still had respect for them as a person, great. I think his career was respectable, it was commendable. He achieved, the pinnacle of his profession. Well, that doesn't make the man any better just because he's gone now. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. I think if we really want to push things forward, we have to recognize that these things need to happen. These people need to go by the wayside. And I just think that's sort of the first step,
When I taught freshman students, my favorite learning style is disruption.
Okay.
I love just upsetting the apple cart and allowing them to appreciate that I realize you are now in this classroom with a very black and white perspective. It is my hope that by the time you finish at least a 4-year degree, you will realize that the world is actually made with shades of gray.
Yes.
And that you have to have a certain amount of compassion and understanding for what is happening in the world. When you talk about the memes, the running joke with my friends, certainly on social media, is because we're filled with librarians, is someone will post something and then immediately someone will post something from Snopes after it, and then there's this huge argument. But yes, welfare queens, I believe, is the term.
Yes.
But then if you look at the statistics, it's like only about 3 to 7% of those who are drawing down any kind of financial assistance from the government could be, I don't know what the term would be, taking advantage
of fraudulent claims.
Right, fraudulent claims. And, in a former life, I was a journalist, and we often did community outreach stories, and I have stood in bread lines and watched people coming in and asking for assistance. These are not welfare queens. These are people who need a hand up. And because it had to come in here somewhere, Nelson Mandela, you know, he, after many years in prison, after a very militant background, after believing that change only came through violent revolution, completely changed his perspective and
People
said,
forget
no,
that.
it comes through education. You know, education needs to be the tool that you use to free yourself from ignorance. And the most powerful thing about that statement was a lot of people didn't realize that he actually was very educated in his own right. When he was exiled and when he was in different countries, he got a law degree and he continued his lifelong learning endeavor while he was imprisoned. And that was something that became a huge linchpin of the new South African government, was increasing access to education, because for so long about 90% of our population had been denied. And I see what's happening in the States, particularly when it comes to disbursement of funds. I think it's for the last decade, government assistance for seeking higher education has decreased by almost 50%.
Wow.
And I'm looking at this and I'm going, okay, so $3 trillion to buy a tank with spinny wheels, and maybe $10 and a Snickers bar to go to college for 4 years if you're lucky. I'm like, what is this saying to the youth about where you really think the future of your country is going?
Absolutely. So, you know, with women in education, we've talked about that, we've covered that. There's a lot of progress that's being made, but I think the biggest thing is the narrative, what we're actually talking about, which is one of the biggest things in my medium is media, entertainment, these things. So, what do you think is, you know, the good and the bad? We've been talking a lot about, and I wrote an article about this a few years ago, but the pervasive thing, at least with our generation, seems to be wanting female representation, or wanting a certain style, a more inclusive style of female representation in media, and how women are treated that way, both positive and negative. I mean, what do you guys think about this? I'm not a woman, so I can't speak on it with authority.
Well, Willis, I've told you about this before, but I'll reiterate. So a couple of years, well, I guess it was more than a couple of years ago now, so Steubenville happened.
Yes.
2 young high school football players.
Was it the high school football players?
Right, you know, swanky house party, lots of booze, lots of minors, very huge lack of any kind of professional or, you know, guardianship or supervision. A young woman from West Virginia happened to be at one of those parties, and it escalated into this entire evening of just debauchery is not even the word, because that makes it sound very like Romanesque. It was just, it was completely unconscionable, the lengths to which this party escalated, in which this young woman was victimized. And one of the things that struck me most about the coverage surrounding Steubenville was how much the narrative focused on the lives of the 2 young men,
I remember that,
Trent Mays and Malik Richmond, who were sort of the center of the controversy because they were the ones that had circulated videos and images of this girl in various states of intoxication and undress, and they were the ones, therefore, that had to bear the mantle for all the guilt, although they certainly weren't the only responsible party. But particularly CNN, who was probably the worst offender, was saying things like, oh, these 2 football stars who would have had a bright future ahead of them, you know, were, you know, found guilty of raping this very drunk girl.
So they're framing it.
So the frame immediately targeted the victim, and there was a lot of discussion in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post about the impact it had on Steubenville as a town, and how it affected, you know, people in Steubenville, and there was just so much conversation about everything other than the fact that how is it that an entire football team of people under the age of 18 were allowed to get to the point of intoxication that raping a woman and taking pictures and sending pictures everywhere was just seen as socially acceptable. Right. Now, I do have to detract and say they weren't found guilty of rape, they were found guilty of digital penetration, which in the Ohio Revised Code has an entirely different description from sexual assault. But so much of that narrative was framed around not victimization, not sexual assault. It was very much framed around, oh, you know, what is happening with, you know, this girl, and she was drinking, and there were other girls that were drinking here. And I've yet to find one person who throws that out as sort of a justification for women who are assaulted that can tell me what the drink to rape ratio is. Right. So how many beverages do I need to consume before it's okay to rape me? And, you know, I say it very tongue-in-cheek, but that's exactly what it is. And I did a research project looking at media framing of Steubenville and the Oscar Pistorius trial in South Africa, which was happening at the same time, to see the public perception that was shaped by the way the coverage was coming out and who they were in defense of. And what I found just in speaking to a lot of people was that there was a great misunderstanding of the actual circumstances behind both of those cases.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I looked up historically, that has always been the way it is, that media shapes public perception, especially in a crime like sexual assault. And unfortunately, it tends to be the victims who end up the losers, whether or not they are proved to be victims in the entirety of it. So to me, there is certainly a great responsibility on behalf of media agencies in general to give just the facts reporting. In fact, that's the type of reporting that the literature bears out is the most impactful in informing people about what sexual assault is. You know, it's not this crime that's perpetuated by monsters hiding behind trees as you're running through the park late at night. You know, 9 out of 10 people who are sexually assaulted will know they're attacked. So the media in general, but media agencies specifically, are doing their due diligence in the way that they report on things like that. And from the South African perspective, the leading cause of death of all women, this is a terrible way to unite across rainbow lines, is the leading cause of death is intimate partner violence. And, you know, that's more than cancer, AIDS, where 1 in 4 people have AIDS, and heart disease combined. And, you know, heart disease is the biggest killer of women in America. So when you draw the parallel, it's like, whoa, this is terrible. And to me, that was even more of a reason why more research needs to be done on media frames of things like sexual assault and intimate partner violence and the impact that it has on women, particularly women in developing countries who are now trying to take their own place in positions of power.
See, there's what it seems to be is that there's, like you said, there's not enough objective reporting about these things. So it seems to me like a lot of people are getting the slant of the story, and that's informing what they think are the facts. And so when they address things that might be an opinion or a slant, like a lawyer would say to get their guy, you know, oh, she was drunk, she did this, that becomes the standard by which to judge, you know, the people. And I just remember because the military is always a couple of years ahead of, you know, American society, just in the matter of integration, you know, promoting of women, sexual assault, and all these other things. Now, we had to go what's called SAPR training. It's a sexual assault prevention and response. And so we had to go to that monthly, at the very least. And so when we were looking at that, it was just kind of like, okay, all right, we know raping people is bad, sexually assaulting people is bad. But then you get to a point where you realize some people coming in, you know, these younger guys are just like, well, what's wrong with, you know, just being drunk? And having to say, okay, well, where did you hear this? And they can never say exactly where they picked it up from. So I think that kind of speaks to what you're saying, is that it's just kind of in the air once it's in the media. You know, somebody says it, then somebody else says it, then somebody repeats it, and then all of a sudden it's a fact. I don't know, do you have anything to add there?
Going along with your story, the Bill Cosby was the next story that came up about those 50 women who came out and said that he sexually assaulted them as well. And I thought it was interesting how the media portrayed them, especially the black community, how they portrayed it. Because a lot of people didn't want, because Bill Cosby, obviously the show was very successful, and they could not let go of the, I don't know, the perception of he's the dad. And they couldn't let that go. And then people were like, well, they were lying. You know, how long did it take them to come forward and this and that? And I'm thinking to myself, like, I have been a victim myself. And I would, when I tried to tell somebody, they kind of like brushed it off, like, oh, you were just probably, and I'm like, no, wait, no. All for me to find out 3 years later, he was raping his sister. And then that person had to call me back to apologize. Like, I am so sorry, this and that. And I'm like, yeah, like, it's really hard to say that. And I mean, I don't know why those women waited so long. However, I do know, like, people don't understand. You can't just come forth and be like, yeah, somebody raped me. Like, that's just not an easy conversation for a woman to have. Because then the conversation comes, oh, well, what were you doing? Well, what were you drinking?
I think the messiest part of the Cosby thing, and I think why it's so layered, is because of the fact that he is a successful black man. There is a very legitimate skepticism from the black community, and, you know, I hear it in the barbershop all the time, of what was Bill Cosby getting into where all of a sudden this just showed up? You know what I mean? All of a sudden this just came out. even as famous as Cosby was after I Spy in the 70s, I think that there's no way his career or even his life could have survived a scandal of sexually assaulting a white woman in 1972. It was something like that. I was like, how did he even get away with this without getting strung up somewhere? And so that, I think, people who aren't willing to put that to one side of their mind and compartmentalize and think about it in multiple ways, they see those things and it kind of becomes a block, maybe psychologically, to be like, this can't be right, because why wouldn't that happen? You know, they can't necessarily compartmentalize. There's a little cognitive dissonance that's not letting them.
I also watched the backstory of Mike Tyson as well.
Oh,
and they were talking about this young girl who, you know, he wanted to take her on a date, and she was so excited. Her father described her as very happy, very, outgoing, and then, like, she came home and was like, you know, he sexually assaulted me, and they drug her through the dirt.
Absolutely.
And like he was like, ever since then, she never spoke a word. She was never the same person. And I literally got to tears because I'm like, poor girl. She had her life set out in front of her. She was, you know, on the beauty queen pageant thing, or, you know, she just was this upbeat girl. And then after that happened and how they, you know, basically damned her, you know, for even speaking against someone who had a career at his height. And I'm just like, oh my.
I just don't know who wouldn't believe that Mike Tyson beat up and victimized somebody. Like, I just don't understand.
You didn't believe that?
Right, but
back then,
right,
there was no talking about that.
Right.
So it's inconsequential. You know, James Wilson from Florida State a couple of years ago, when the prosecutor came forward and said, yes, he probably did sexually assault the girl who accused him of it, but, you know, they waited a bit too long for us to process the evidence, so we had no choice but to drop the case. And then you hear up in Cleveland, there's 18,000 unprocessed rape kits just kind of sitting back in the police station. And, you know, it just so happened that a reporter from the Plain Dealer broke that open. And then there was a grant to get all this processed, and now all this criminal litigation pending. You know, it's uncomfortable for us to talk about, but I think part of that is because the narrative for so long has been skewed toward putting the onus of responsibility on the person who was victimized.
Right.
Which is just, you know, that's not a way to change a narrative by any stretch of the imagination. And the Department of Justice every now and again does surveys where they ask people about their perspectives of crimes. And in 2001, they did a survey with high school students, and 50% of the high school girls surveyed and 76% of the boys surveyed said that they believed that forced sex was acceptable under certain circumstances. Now, this is the gross majority of students who are coming into the higher education environment. Big surprise, the idea of campus sexual assault has exploded in the last few years, particularly with all the federal investigations because of Title IX violations. So I think one of the reasons why that narrative is so strong now and why there's so much attention is because there are more women in positions of power. But still, there needs to be more, and there needs to be more, I think, camaraderie and cooperation between people who are involved in shaping the narrative, because that's really the only way that things are going to be more equitable.
No, I've always looked more practically at how to fix problems. So, you know, women in education, educating women, getting women into the sciences, into engineering, into the things of the future, information technology, infrastructure, space programs, things like that. I want to be able to put these things together and also be able to address women's health in a way that's able to, you know, that's able to be across the board helpful for everyone. Now, I think that's the way to empower women, but do you think that, let's say that there is the body positive movement, there is the the Tell Her She's Beautiful movement, all these other things like that, and talking about Disney princesses, even down to that sort of minutia. Do you think that is just as important, or does it have its own small role to play, or where do you think that sort of falls?
I think it's just as important. They were actually talking about Barbie on the radio the other day.
Okay.
And another guy, well, everybody pretty much agreed about Barbie being a different race, being a different shape, and that it basically represents more women across the United States or wherever. And there was one guy who disagreed, and he was like, I disagree because he said, I feel that if you let a Barbie influence your way of parenting your child, then there's an issue with that it comes all the way down to Barbie. And I'm just like, well, I do understand your point. However, kids that's how they learn, through play and what they play with. And, just, I think we learn from our environment in general, and when our environment starts to change, I think we can be more accepting to different things. But that's just my personal opinion. So I think that changing things around us is just as important as, I feel like it is a form of education. Barbie is a form of education, regardless if people think it's on the lower end or if it's stupid. Barbie is still an educational, thing for children to learn. That's just me. But I think that, we do need to.
Now, you might be able to fill me in because I've just completely lost my mind on what the name of the doll study was.
That's what I was just trying to think of too, but that was systematically the reason that Brown versus Board of Education was able to happen.
Because they took black children.
Are you talking about that video?
This was in like the 50s. They took black children into these little therapy sessions, and they would give them white dolls.
Oh, and they would point to which one was ugly.
Which is the ugly doll, which is the good doll, which is the bad doll. These are the things, and all the negative things, even at 4 or 5 years old, these little black children are pointing to the black doll that looks like them and saying, this is bad, or this is wrong, or this is ugly. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the psychology of people around you.
True.
Because, to me, it informs me that it doesn't matter that you have a black doll, it matters what the association of black skin is. So you can have as many different colored or shaped dolls as you want. If there's a fat Barbie, you know what I mean, then, it doesn't change the fact that the kid might see that as still being a negative thing. So I think if you change the conversation, then the rest of it will kind of fall into place. So I've always been sort of torn on that. They're saying, I see articles about like, here's Disney princesses with more realistic waistlines. Why do you need that? I'm just trying to figure out, what is the benefit to that, or is it the fact that we have accepted that beauty or attractiveness is currency as opposed to usefulness or intelligence or something like that?
What do you mean accepted? What do you mean?
Is that we've stopped fighting. I think it seems like we've stopped fighting, saying, okay, well, maybe you're not ever going to be a beauty queen, but you could still be an engineer, you can still be a rocket scientist, you can still be a lawyer, you can still be president of the United States. Being a beauty queen is not the end-all be-all of your worth.
That is what how society has set us up to be.
So that's what I'm saying, is that we've accepted that that's it, and we've not even attempted to fight it. Right. It seems now as that we're trying to get accepted into a club of, well, let's just expand the meaning of beautiful instead of ignoring that is not my worth. Right. So that seems like, that just seemed annoying to me. And another thing is, I've always thought, Kate and I talking, I said, I'm terrified to bring up a little girl in this world because there's just so much coming from each side. Not only are you black, but you're also female. So that's, you've got two targets on your back, as you know. So I'm just thinking, are we doing enough? Is it enough to just say, oh, well, look, we've got nice female characters in these children's movies, or we've got different shaped people in books or there? Or is that frivolous? Is that just as important? I'm just trying to think from a woman's perspective.
Well, I can tell you, certainly from the picture book perspective, one of the great things about higher education is that, as you're trying to find a way to pay for this prohibitively expensive exercise, you get to do things on the dime of the university, if you fight for it, that you might not necessarily encounter in your everyday life. And I had the opportunity to work with a woman who is a school library media specialist, and she's very, very well educated in terms of picture books and the impact that picture books have on children. And apparently for many years it has been the accepted standard that what increases children's willingness to read and in fact desire to read is seeing characters in picture books who represent them.
All right.
So, back to your point with the Barbies and everything, I think there is a certain amount of credence to be given to the body positive movement and what it's trying to do, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it detracts from the narrative, which is your point. It's just like one piece of you.
Right.
Like, don't worry about it. And we see that every time some knob comes out and says something like, oh no, we can't have men and women working side by side in labs because the women are sexual beings and they detract the men from the important sciencey stuff. And then, you know, you see women who are engineers and way smarter than I could ever imagine to be, taking pictures of themselves head to toe in what looks like a massive body condom. Here I am, sexually distracting my male colleagues, you know, and it's so offensive that so many times the narrative is turned back to, well, you're a female and inherently, you know, you're prohibiting men from doing their work by imposing yourself on that world order. But I think of what happens when I'm working in an environment where diversity is truly reflected, where there are people from different nations, from different backgrounds, even in higher education. The difference between first generation and third generation college students is astounding. And you just learn all these things, and I think it makes you a better, more well-rounded person. And you're not so focused on, oh, you know, I really want to go on this Impolite conversation show and talk about all of this smart, fancy stuff, but, you know, I'm having a bad thigh day, so I'm going to skip it. So, you know, it really bothers me that so many times the narrative is shifted back to it. And, you know, that's great. Body positivity is a fantastic thing, but I can tell you, going to an all-girls high school where we all wore the same uniform and we all had the same curriculum, you wanted to stand out, you had to be smart, you had to be diligent, and you had to fight your way to get to the top. It wasn't about, oh, you know, who wore Gucci or Prada today, or, you know, who was impressing the boys. There was none of that. You know, you had to excel in the classroom, and that was how you really made your way through.
Go ahead.
I wanted to pose a question to the both of you. Because of all this, it's kind of raised the question in my mind, and this will be one of the last things we talk about. Do you think that life affects media or informs media, or do you think media informs life? Do you think it's a mixture of the two? Because in my eyes, we were talking about female doctors and engineers. If I have a daughter and I take her to a pediatrician who is a female, do you think seeing that and knowing I can become a doctor because my doctor is a woman, do you think that is more effective, or do you think being able to watch television as a teenager and seeing more female doctors played on television has more of an effect?
To a certain extent, I think it depends on the issue.
Okay.
For me, my two biggest role models are my parents, and I like to believe that I have some of the best of both of them. My dad, very authoritative and very passionate about what he does. My mother, no less passionate, but in a very neutral and patient and tolerant way.
Okay.
So I've been able to engender those both perspectives, but, you know, as a united front, they always let me know, growing up in a very patriarchal, still very racist, barely out of apartheid culture, that, you know, just because this person tells you you have to be this way doesn't mean that that's what needs to happen. You get to make that choice. And they always encouraged me, you know, to pursue my dreams and do what I wanted to do, especially going into journalism. The biggest reason being that I didn't like what was happening in the media that I saw, you know, which was largely government controlled. But, you know, when you come back to issues that are typically reflective on, I guess we could say, the femininity of women, or, you know, as Betty Friedan might call it, the feminist mystique. It tends to be very anti-woman, unfortunately, for a lot of the mainstream media agencies, and I don't think that's a coincidence. You know, when organizations like the Huffington Post came out, that narrative started to shift in a few media agencies because they weren't white, male, Republican controlled.
Right.
And I am a huge fan of Renegade Media Organization. It's very sad that we're in an age where we need an organization like Anonymous to be our watchdog, because as the fourth estate, that was the role of the media. So I think some of it is shifting, and as more organizations like Huffington Post, and I hate to say it, but BuzzFeed.
BuzzFeed.
Right, and more like
I love it.
underground rebel media organizations sort of come to the fore and gain popularity. I think that narrative is slowly but surely changing in some ways, but I really think there needs to be more collaboration and cooperation, not just between women, but between women and men, particularly in the millennial generation, because they are the ones who are going to shape what happens in the next 20 to 30 years.
Keisha, what do you think?
I would have to say I was a little bit different because my parents were so you know, my father wasn't in my life and my mom was too busy worried about survival, how we're going to survive every day, I really didn't get that attention, so I had to seek it elsewhere.
Okay.
So I had to look at what was on TV, because I was at home by myself majority of the time, what I thought, and that was the whole, like, mind frame of what beauty was.
Right.
Where do I fit in? Or how will I ever be able to go to college? Because nobody in my family went to college but me. So here I am trying to, you know, figure my way out through life. So for me, it was a little different. I had to go to media to see what I need to be doing. Although along the way, I did meet other people who were educated and, you know, had the two-parent family home. So they kind of, I think it's a combination of both, both media and your life.
Because depending on your circumstances, you can,
on your circumstances. And I went through the whole looking elsewhere to figure out where I need to go in life. I used to think that I was going to be a video girl. Can you believe that?
Those are goals right there.
In my mind, I was thinking, I cannot wait to be on a video. I cannot wait to dance like those black girls on the video, because they get attention and doing all that. Well, along the way, I had to change the social work.
Right.
And I found my way. Secretly in my mind, I want to be a stripper, but that's that's neither here nor there. Anyway, but yes, I had to find my path, and it was just a combination of both. And you know, the surroundings are very important, and what people teach you at home is very important. I think that's super important, because I didn't get taught anything. I had to learn on my own. But fortunately, I did find my way. So.
I'd say, you know, and just briefly from the male perspective of seeing things, I've often said this, and I've made this equivalence, is that, you know, Barbie is this sort of unattainable goal that for all girls when they're little. And I said that James Bond is kind of Barbie for boys. There's this thing of where you have this perfect male specimen who's got the best job, the best cars, the best clothes.
He is fine,
and right, so you have these things where you can get pieces of the identity, but never the whole thing. You know, if you want to be Barbie, you can have the house, you can have the clothes, you can look like Barbie, but you can't have all of it. You know, for James Bond, you can be a spy, but you're not going to look like James Bond. You know what I mean? You can have the cars, but you're not going to have the job. You can have, you know, the clothes, but you're not going to have the car. There's just certain, you can never have the full deck. And I don't think that's as harmful as people make it out to be. I think that there's always should be you should never, you know, leave your life completely satisfied, I don't think. Because there's always something to kind of push you forward and be like, man, I wish I had that. Because that envelops, that's what fantasy is for. I mean, that's the name of my business is putting a fantasy up for people to enjoy. And it doesn't have to be completely accessible. You know, you can have some things that are just out of reach, and it makes people keep watching.
Speaking of Barbie, I just wanted to include in that natural hair movement.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
How Barbie, now me looking at Barbie, I ain't got blonde hair, nor do I got blue eyes, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty, I'm never going to be there. So in my mind, I'm playing like, and even today, I still talk to managers that are, well, in supervisory roles at my agency, and they're black women, and they had to ask other black women, like, oh, is it okay for me to wear my afro because it's not, you know, because this is not considered professional. And I found out that historically, black women weren't able to even wear their hair out. They had to wear wraps around their hair because we wasn't allowed to do that. So now that the natural hair movement is coming, you know, it is
again,
a new,
by the way, again, this is the sentence,
you know, thing for us. Not new, but we want to be able to be ourselves. We can't even wear our hair straight half the time because it's heat damage.
All right, so final points. We're going to wrap up here. We've talked about politics, we've talked about education, we've talked about women in media, all these other things. What do you think? I'll give mine first. I think that for a society to get better, and one of the great quotes I've read is that if you want to see how civilized a society is, look how it treats its women. And I think that's a huge thing. Now, in my opinion, I think that if we can increase focus on the sciences, if we can increase women's health, and if we can give them their own, civil rights and autonomy of their own bodies, even, let alone, just civil rights. I think that that's the way towards progress. What do you think we can do culturally, politically, even interpersonally, to make this world better for women and girls? I'm going to start with Shelley.
I think that any huge social or structural change or cultural revolution really does need to start at home.
Okay.
Every time I hear like a male chastise a male child and say, stop crying like a girl, or you're being a complete sissy, or that kind of language, or when young girls speak up in class and they're like, oh, you're so bossy, that is where I think that change needs to occur the strongest. And it's become such an ingrained part of our culture that, I'm sure we're all guilty of doing it at some point, but until one of the reasons I refer to myself as a latter-day feminist is because growing up in South Africa, which is very patriarchal, still is, violence against women is ridiculous. It wasn't until I started exploring that narrative on my own, looking into a journalist and speaking more to the females in my life and asking them about their experiences, which were very different from male experiences in South Africa, and then learning more about it when I came over here, that I went, this is crap. This is crap, and we need to do something about it. And it was one of those things that once my eyes were opened, I saw it everywhere.
Right.
So now I have to be very cautious about how I approach something, but when I hear some twat waffle say something like, stop being such a girl, I go, oh, I'm sorry. Is there something wrong with being a girl? Because 9 times out of 10 they won't even realize that they've said it.
Right.
So again, I really think that's where that cultural shift happens at the grassroots level, and being aware of how we shape our own individual cultural surroundings.
I have to agree. I want to say during the whole cultural shift, and I also think education is very important, and continuing to educate yourself. I think that people get themselves in a box or get so used to what they know instead of expanding and having the conversation. I think that's so important to have those difficult conversations, and a lot of time people run away from difficult conversations, whether it's race, politics, religion, just all different type of topics. People tend to just back up from those conversations instead of just sitting, learning, even expressing, like you said, even expressing their opinions, even if they don't agree. And at least you can hear from somebody else's perspective that sees the world in a different eye than what you see. And I think that's just important in how we can grow together and be together if we can just listen to one another. And I've come to learn that even though you may have a cultural difference, it's okay to have a culture. And I think that people get so caught up into, oh, well, if you don't do it this way, this isn't the right way. No, it's just culturally different, and it's okay to be different. To
embrace the change, basically.
Yes, embrace people's differences. It is okay. As long as they're not breaking the law trying to kill you, then, it's okay what they believe in.
Or wearing socks with sandals. Can we all just universally agree that's one thing
you need to cut that one. But ultimately, I think that if everybody has that conversation and everybody can embrace differences, I think we'll be better. We can move forward.
Okay, great, fantastic. Now, see, this is our first episode, and as you can see, this is great stuff. We go from a range of topics, we talk about everything, but trying to keep in the same vein. Now, I want you guys to tune in next time. Our next episode is going to be great. The whole series is great. I'm really excited for it. We're going to have these guys back on. Keisha Capri, Shelley Blundell. You guys have anything to plug? You got a book? You got any studies? Anything coming out? Just know.
I'm actually working on my second book. It's going to be called The Year of the Woman, Turning Your Sadness into Strength. So be on the lookout for that.
All right. Shelley, you got anything?
Yes, as often as possible and as frequently as possible, be apprised of your local resources, Domestic Violence Project, battered women's shelters. Give to them if you can, support them if you can, and if you need them, please, please, please use those resources.
Right. Now, that's the final word. I'll see you guys on the next episode of Impolite Conversation. I'm Willis Gordon. Thank you very much.